The Ismaili community is one of the major Shi'i Muslim communities. They came into being during the formative period of Islam, more specifically in the year 765. Now, prior to that, the Ismailis shared the same heritage with what later became known as the 12 Shi'i community.
Dr Farhad Daftary is Director Emeritus of the Institute of Ismaili Studies and a member of its Board of Governors. He is the foremost authority in Ismaili studies and fundamentally reshaped the field through his own scholarship and by overseeing the publication of dozens of books from the IIS. He's currently editing the Encyclopedia of the Ismailis.
I want to talk about the belief systems.
They believe that the sacred scriptures and also the prohibitions and commandments of religion, including Islam and including the text of the Quran, they had their apparent literal meaning, which should be distinguished from their spirituality hidden in the batin dimension.
And before Islam?
Before, they applied the same model to pre-Islamic religions as well, to Judaism, to Christianity, and even to some ancient religions of Iran, like, for instance, Zoroastrianism. The laws change because they reflect changes in circumstances. The Sharia has changed, but their inner spirituality remains the same. In fact, it's very suitable for our times today, for the global world. Universalism, we have to learn to think in universal terms, which would bring people of different traditions and religions together, rather than emphasizing the divergences or the differences. We must concentrate on the commonalities. And this framework will give us that tool of thought.
Welcome to Muslim Footprints, a deep dive into Muslim civilizations through the ages, accompanied by some of the best experts in their field. We've called this episode The Ismailis, from their origins to modern times.
Dr Farhad Daftary, can you give us a quick snapshot of the Ismaili community?
Yes. Well, the Ismaili community, as you know, is one of the major Shi'i Muslim communities. They came into being during the formative period of Islam, more specifically in the year 765. Now, prior to that, which means between the time of the Prophet and the year 765, the Ismailis shared the same heritage with what later became known as the 12 Shi'i community. But it was in the year 765, on the death of the fifth or the sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, that his Imami Shi'i following split into a number of groups, one of which may be identified with the earliest Ismailis.
And today, so the Ismailis are part of the Shi'i branch of Islam.
Yes.
Today they are scattered in some 30 countries or more?
Yes, 25, 30 countries, yes.
Numbering 10 million?
Between 10 and 15, yeah.
And they're also assassins.
They are not assassins. They were made famous in Europe by the medieval crusaders as the assassins. And when that term came into being, it still had not acquired the meaning that it has today in most European languages. At that time, the name was really the sort of designation that was used by the Crusaders in reference to this mysterious Oriental community. And we'll get into the reason why the Crusaders, called it the assassins later on.
What have been, before we start on the history, what have been the challenges of writing the story of this group?
Yes, well, there are basically two challenges which are actually interconnected. One, as always we cannot write or talk about the history of a community if we do not have reliable sources to base our work on. And in the case of the Ismailis, that was and continues still to some extent to be a continuing problem, lack of reliable sources. For the early period, we don't have any sources because at that time the Ismailis were involved in conducting a revolutionary movement, and under the peculiar circumstances of the time, they preferred to propagate their ideas by the word of mouth. Therefore, we do not have any texts from the pre-Fatimid time in the history of the community. And later on, the sort of literature that was actually produced by the Ismailis, especially during the Fatimid period of their history, which was a very rich literature, and it really covered a wide range of subject matters. That literature was not, generally speaking, accessible to outsiders. So that's just one set of problems. The second set has to do with what was actually available on the history and teachings of the community. Because the genuine Ismaili sources were not available to outsiders, so the outsiders began to fabricate their own sources. Now, this may sound very odd to us today. We may ask the question as to what was their motive for doing that. The motive was that the Ismailis from the beginning represented a revolutionary movement. They aimed to bring down the established Sunni Abbasid order. And therefore, when they came to power as in terms of the Fatimid Caliphate, a literary campaign was launched, supported by the Sunni ulama and the Abbasid ruling class. This campaign was, it aimed to defame the Ismailis from early on and to provide basis for refuting them and for condemning them. This is why they began to fabricate their own texts in which they attributed a whole range of shocking teachings and practices to the members of the Ismaili community, on the basis of which they could then refute them and condemn them as heretics, meaning deviators from the right path. And that was the situation really until 1930s and 1940s, when the scholarly world found access to genuine Ismaili sources for the first time. These sources, which had been produced mainly in Arabic and Persian languages, had been preserved and guarded very secretly by various Ismaili communities in different regions, including Yemen, Syria, Iran, Central Asia, and South Asia. Now, when this literature, this rich and diverse literary heritage of the community became accessible to scholars, a completely new image began to emerge regarding the history and the teachings of the community, this time based on genuine Ismaili sources. And that really brought about the modern revolution in the field of Ismaili studies, which is still ongoing.
How did you become interested in Ismaili studies?
I became interested in Ismaili studies for a variety of reasons. At the time when I really began my work in this field, I was a graduate student in the University of California in Berkeley, studying economics, actually. I was doing my PhD in economics, but I had really an interest in Ismaili, I mean, not specifically in Ismaili studies, but in history of Islam and history of Shi'i Islam. And in that connection, I began to read the very, very sort of scarce and limited literature that was available in 1960s. And then, of course, I realized soon that there actually existed so many gaps in this field, especially you see, historical gaps which needed to be filled by further research, and that really induced me to enter into the field of Ismaili studies. Yeah.
Okay. Let's start the history right from the beginning. Tell us the early history of the Ismailis from the start of Islam. I suppose they weren't known as Ismailis then, right?
Yes, right.
So we talk about them as part of the Shia movement?
Part of the general Shi'i movement. The origin of the Sunni-Shi'i divide, as you know, dates back to the question of succession to the Prophet Muhammad. There were basically two views upheld within the community. What became known as the Sunni majority held from early on that the Prophet had not appointed a successor, and therefore they took it upon themselves to elect in a certain way the successor to the Prophet. By contrast, what became known as Shia, the word Shia means party, which is derived from Shi'atu Ali, or the party of Ali. By contrast, they believed that the Prophet himself had actually designated under divine command his cousin and son-in-law, Ali, to succeed him. And that the leadership of the community, therefore, would belong to Ali and his descendants, the Alites. The offsprings, mainly of two of his sons by the Prophet's daughter, Hassan and Hussein, but also another son by another spouse. Now, in due time, the Alites themselves of all branches had become so numerous that the Shia, those who upheld the right of Ali and his family to the leadership, could not agree now amongst themselves as who was the rightful leader, or the Imam, as the Shia prefer to call the spiritual leader of the community. Therefore, on that basis, on disagreements on the question of imamat, the Shia themselves split into a number of factions. One major faction became known as the Imami or the Imamiyah, the Imami Shi'is, and they acknowledged a line of Imams in the progeny of Imam Hussein, the son of Ali. And on the death of one of these Imams, namely Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq in the year 765, his Shi'i following split into a number of groups and communities, two of which may be identified with the Ismailis and the later Isna Asharis or 12er Shi'is. So that's really, in a nutshell, the gist of the early history of the Ismaili community.
So, right, so Ismailis get their name from the son of Ja'far Sadiq.
The elder son, Ismail.
And then you have imams between this and the emergence of the Fatimid state.
Yes, yes.
This period is known as the Dor al-Satr,
Yes.
which is the period of concealment.
Of concealment of the imams.
And how can we understand what's happening here?
This is one of the most sort of difficult periods to study from the viewpoint of a historian, again because of the sources. This was made especially difficult because of its very nature. Because it was the period of concealment, so the imams actually made not only they did not, produce any written record of their activities, but they made every effort to hide that record and to actually concealed their true identity and place of residence, and for that reason they even adopted a number of pseudonyms and code names and so on. So for that reason, we have very little factual information about that period. But modern scholarship has been able, more or less now, in the last 30, 40 years, to put together a broad picture of what might have transpired during that period. That was also the revolutionary period in the life of the community. A revolutionary movement was organized and led by those central leaders of the Dawah or the community, who were the hidden imams. And the message of this revolutionary movement was actually disseminated in various, by the middle of the 9th century, the message was received in almost every region of the Islamic world.
Tell us how. Tell us why the imams were hiding.
They were hiding because they were actually organizing this revolution against the established order. Because from early on, the Ismailis, in line with other Shi'i groups and leaders, believed that the rights of Ali and his family had been usurped by the early caliphs, and then by the Umayyads, and then by the Abbasids. So the main objective of the Ismaili movement, as I said, was to uproot the Abbasids and to install the Imam acknowledged by the Ismailis to the leadership of a new caliphate. And this was the message that was disseminated by the Ismaili da'is, or propagandists, or missionaries, who worked in various regions from Central Asia all the way to North Africa. And it was really in North Africa that the early success of the Ismaili Dawah led to the creation of a Dawla, or a state, namely the Fatimid Caliphate, under the leadership of the Ismaili Imam of the time, Abdullah al-Mahdi, who founded the Fatimid Caliphate in Afriqiya, which covered today's Tunisia and eastern parts of Algeria. Now, this success was largely due to the activities of one of the da'is who had been active in that region, the da'i Abu Abdullah al-Shi'i. He had been active amongst the Berbers of North Africa, especially the Kotama faction, clan of the Berbers, for almost 20 years. And as a culmination of his activities, he prepared the ground for the coming of Abdullah al-Mahdi, the Imam. He lived originally in Syria, in Salamiyya, but in the year 902, he left Salamiyya, spent a bit of time in Palestine, then a bit of time in Egypt, and finally he headed for the town of Sejel Masa, which is today in the southern part of Morocco. And he waited there for 4 years until Da'i Abu Abdullah al-Shi'i had prepared the ground and had brought down the Aghlabids, who had been ruling over that part of North Africa on behalf of the Abbasids. So once he had done that, then he went down to the city of Sejel Masa and handed over the reins of power to his master, the Imam of the time, Abdullah al-Mahdi, who was brought to Qayrawan. In fact, he arrived in the city of Qayrawan in January of 910, which really, formally initiated the rule of the Fatimids. And the reason why they chose the name Fatimid is because they traced their ancestry to Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet.
A dynasty named after a woman.
Dynasty named after a woman, yes, definitely. In fact, it may be the only dynasty in Islam named after a woman, to my knowledge.
I want to talk about the doctrines and the belief systems. Ismailis were known as the most esoteric.
Yes.
Are there some doctrines that were particularly, or that stand? They had, for example, a cyclical interpretation of time. They had some fascinating cosmological beliefs.
Yes.
Can you give us a very quick understanding of those?
Let us begin at the beginning. When we talk about esoteric thought or tradition, we are entering a domain in which a fundamental distinction is made between the apparent and the hidden, between the exoteric and the esoteric, or between the zahir and the batin, the terms used by the Ismailis themselves. They believe that the sacred scriptures and also the prohibitions and commandments of religion, including Islam and including the text of the Quran, they had their apparent literal meaning, which should be distinguished from their spirituality hidden in the batin, in the batin dimension. And it's this distinction that sets apart the esotericists, those who uphold esotericism, from others, or from those who concentrate or who focus mainly on literal kind of traditions, like the Sunni fuqaha or the jurists of the 12 Shia. At certain periods during their history, they emphasized the batin, the hidden, by contrast to the zahir. At other times, like the Fatimid period, they placed equal emphasis on the zahir and the batin, on the apparent and the hidden, or the spirituality. And they, in their teachings, they repeatedly stress that one cannot exist without the other, and that each of these two dimensions or perspectives has a function to perform. Now, this was the broad frame. Now, they had further teachings in this context. To go from the zahir to the batin, or from the apparent, from understanding the literal meaning, let's say, of the Quran or a text, to its hidden spiritual reality, you needed the guide, you needed the guidance of the authorized guides of your period. This is where the function of the imam comes in, and also the function of the cyclical history. Human beings by themselves, by using their own khirad or aql or intellect, cannot find access to the hidden truths of religion, to the essence of the message of Islam, which is the same as the essence of other Abrahamic religions. To go from the apparent to the hidden, you need guidance. That guidance is provided by the Imam of the time, that by his virtue of belonging to the Ahlul Bayt, to the household of the Prophet, he is in possession of a certain type of ilm or knowledge which is not accessible by ordinary people. And therefore, in each era of human history, there are the authorized guides of that period, namely the natiq, or the speaker, or the prophet of that period, who brought a Sharia, plus his successor or wasi, and the imams. In the era of Islam, the authorized guides are the Prophet Muhammad, his wasi, which is his successor, son-in-law and cousin Ali, and the imams recognized by the Ismailis.
And before Islam?
They apply the same model to pre-Islamic religions as well, to Judaism, to Christianity, and even to some ancient religions of Iran, like, for instance, Zoroastrianism. The Ismailis accommodated for all known religions mentioned, at least those mentioned in the Quran. the religions of the people of the book, Ahl Kitab. So in that sense, you have this ecumenical really approach of the Ismailis, who believe that there are immutable truths hidden in the bottom of religion, which are shared in common by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. The laws change because they reflect changes in circumstances. The Sharia has changed. But their inner spirituality remains the same. This is why they said that the bottom contains the immutable, unchangeable truths, or the haqa'iq, which do not change. And this was one of the attractions of the Ismailis, to attract converts from other religions.
Was it tactical, or they genuinely believe this?
I think it was part of their religious system of thought, which itself had been brought about by by a variety of different influences.
Right. So Greek and
the Greek, the Persians, all of these
Persians, yeah,
had inputs into this religious system. Some of it can be traced to the teachings of the early Shi'i Ghulat, who came from a variety of different backgrounds, ancient Babylonians, Persians, and so on. And they all contributed to the richness and dynamism of the Ismaili faith and theology.
And do they still believe that today?
That's a good question. I suppose so. If they believe in that system, they must believe in what that system implies, which is the unchangeable truths of religion. Different religions, basically are saying the same thing. There are certain unchangeable truths common to all the major religions, to all the Abrahamic monotheistic religions. Each prophet of those various religions, they brought different laws, different sharias, as deemed necessary by the circumstances of their time. But in essence, the essence of all those sharias were the same. Those are the truths hidden in the bottom.
Okay, so the success
These are, of course, rather complicated, difficult ideas,
But it's very interesting.
Yes,
It's
yeah.
really fascinating. So even if we can give people a snapshot
Yes,
that this
yeah.
exists, and then if they're interested,
Yeah.
they can go and read
Yeah.
more.
Yeah.
They can go to the lovely library.
I don't know
here.
of any other Muslim community that has such a rich theological, philosophical literature or heritage, really. It's in fact, it's very suitable for our times today, for the global world. Universalism. We have to learn to think in universal terms, which would bring people of different traditions and religions together, rather than emphasizing the divergences or the differences. We must concentrate on the commonalities. And this framework will give us that tool of thought.
Well, we'll go back to the Fatimid age now. The success of the Ismaili Dawah culminated in the establishment of an Ismaili state. This period was known as the Golden Age of Ismailism. The Imam ruled over a vast empire. We've done a whole episode on the Fatimids. Do you want to tell us what the main features were of this period?
The main features were several, in fact. One was that, of course, the Ismailis had now, for the first time, come into the possession of a powerful state. So instead of being severely and frequently persecuted, they now could practice their faith openly within the borders of the Fatimid state. This was one major achievement, and that never happened again. It had not happened before, and it did not happen after the fall of the Fatimid state. maybe it was to some extent it also happened during the state founded by the Nizari Ismailis in Persia and Syria. That was one. Two, because of this safety, it provided an atmosphere in which Ismaili thought could actually flourish. This thought was contributed to by the learned Ismaili dais of the period, many of whom came from the eastern lands, the Iranian world, people like al-Nasafi al-Razi, al-Sijistani, al-Kirmani, Abu al-Mayyid al-Shirazi, and last but not least, Nasser Khusro. These were giants in their own ways, and they, in fact, also fabricated a specifically Shi'i tradition of learning, and that was combining theology with philosophy into what we call today philosophical Ismailism, which briefly put, it was to go up, to dress up Ismaili theology, which revolved around the central doctrine of Imamat, in terms and ideas and traditions, intellectual, which had appealed to highly educated strata of society. And for that reason, they adopted and adapted Neoplatonic philosophy and other philosophical traditions. This was the first instance of its kind in the entire Muslim world when theology and philosophy were combined. You don't come across a second example of this effort until the Safavid times in Iran, with the work of the so-called School of Isfahan. They combined theology with philosophy with Sufism, or Irfan.
And why was that so notable, or what were the main outcomes of this?
The outcome of it was that it did have appeal to the elite of the society, because in the Western lands, by West I mean west of Iraq, Yemen, North Africa, especially in the revolutionary phase of the movement, the community needed numbers, so they were interested in large numbers. But once the Fatimid state had been founded, quality became more important than quantity. Therefore, the dais began to focus on the type of individuals that they wanted to attract into their community. They wanted highly educated and also rulers, because very often by converting the ruler of a region, they could convert the entire population of that region. And they did, in fact, manage to convert a number of the rulers, including a Samanid ruler, a ruler in the region of Multan in Sindh, as a result of which the inhabitants of that region were also converted. And they also managed to convert a number of powerful, influential individuals in the Iranian world.
Who were some of the key personalities of this period?
Key personalities of this period, of course, we always come to the question of dais. Dais were really not only the propagandists or the missionaries of the community, but they were also the scholars and authors of the community. And the rich literature that has come down to us was in fact produced by these dais. Foremost amongst them, of course, was Al-Qazi al-Nu'man, the foremost jurist of the Fatimid time, who in the time of Al-Mu'izz, the Fatimid Imam Caliph, and with the guidance and support of the Imam, managed to codify Ismaili law. Because until then, the Ismailis did not have a legal school, a mazhab, like the 4 Sunni schools and the 12 Shi'is. But it was as a result of Al-Nu'man's efforts which actually culminated in a book entitled Da'am al-Islam, or the Pillars of Islam, in 2 volumes. The first volume deals with ibadat, or acts of worship. The second volume deals with the worldly affairs, like, for instance, inheritance and, food and drink and so on. And this became the legal code of the Fatimid state, and its precepts were observed throughout the judiciary. And Al-Nu'man was also the founder of a dynasty of jurists who became chief judges after him, his son and grandson and his great-grandson. There were also learned dais who, many of whom, as I just mentioned, came from the Iranian world, from Central Asia, and from Iran. And these dais had really many challenges. Of course, you may not know this, but the Fatimids came to power in a very strange part of the Muslim world, in a part where Shi'ism of any tradition had not had any backgrounds. The region of North Africa was very Sunni and Khariji. The cities were populated by Arabs who were, for the most part, Sunnis, under the leadership of their powerful Maliki Sunni jurists. And the countryside was populated by Berbers, who mainly belonged to the Ibadi Khariji faction, the third dimension of Islam. So the Fatimids, who were, of course, the Imams of the Ismailis, came to power, and the Ismailis came to power as a minority, and they remained a minority throughout North Africa, and even when they transferred the seat of their state to Egypt in the year 973, but 4 years after they had founded the city of Cairo themselves, in the immediate aftermath of their conquest of Egypt. Even in Egypt, they continued to represent a minority. So within the Ismaili state, the Ismailis were a minority, and Ismailism disappeared on the downfall of the Fatimid dynasty and caliphate. It was outside of the Fatimid state where the Ismailis were persecuted that Ismailism found its greatest and most lasting success. Why? Why did they succeed where they were persecuted? Because the people of those regions had already been familiar with various Shi'i traditions, including the Ismaili tradition. And Shi'ism had roots in most of those regions.
This golden age ends upon the death of the Caliph Imam al-Mustansir in 487 or 1094. Then there's this split between his successors. And this is when you get, so you get the Nizari.
Two of his sons, not his successor.
Yes. So you have a split between 2 of his sons.
Yes.
Nizar, who was the eldest and the heir designate.
Yes.
And Ahmed, who was the youngest.
Right.
So tell us what happens here and how the Ismailis.
The splits in Shi'ism, actually throughout history, they always came about revolving around the question of succession to a deceased imam. There was always sort of the splits that we noticed revolved around succession disputes, usually between 2 or more sons. In this case, as you said, Nizar was the original heir to designate, but the state at the time was run really by the Wazir. In fact, ever since the arrival of Badr Jamali to Egypt, who succeeded in restoring law and order to a rather chaotic situation in the year 1074, since that time, the reins of power were held by Wazirs, not the caliphs in the Fatimid state. So when Imam Caliph al-Mustansir died in 1094, the all-powerful Wazir, the son and successor of Badr Jamali al-Afzal, wanted to stay in power as he was, and he favored the candidacy of Nizar's much younger half-brother, who was installed to the Fatimid throne with the honorific title of Al-Musta'li Billah. Nizar did not accept this machination. It was a palace, fled to Alexandria, rose in revolt, was initially successful with the help of the Alexandrians and the Qazi, the chief judge of the city. But eventually, Al-Afzal, the Fatimid Wazir, took the field himself with the Fatimid army, and he managed to defeat Nizar, to arrest him and to bring him to Cairo, where he was apparently executed. This caused a major split, perhaps the first major split in the Ismaili community and Dawah, between those who accepted what had happened in Egypt and those who did not. The leader of those who did not was a fellow by the name of Hassan Sabbah, who was already a da'i in Iran. About 4 years earlier, he had established himself in the fortress of Alamut, in the mountain fortress of Alamut in northern Iran. But at the time, he was working on behalf of the Fatimids. When this succession dispute occurred in Cairo, he sided with Nizar and broke off his relations with Cairo and the Fatimid regime, which had supported the rights of al-Musta'li to the caliphate and the imamat. And by contrast, Hassan Sabbah now recognized Nizar as the next imam in succession to al-Mustansir, and he founded the Nizari Ismaili Dawah, or branch of Ismailism. He had already founded what became known as the Ismaili state. Now he also founded the Nizari Ismaili Dawah. He was the first ruler of the state. He was succeeded by seven other individuals until 1256, when this state was uprooted by the all-conquering Mongols, who went on to also uproot the Abbasid Caliphate 2 years later. In 1258, they went to Baghdad. Now, so this really sort of brings us to
a new period,
chapter, new era, new chapter.
Yes.
In the life of the community.
Muslim Footprints is developed and produced by Kalima Communications in partnership with the Ismaili, the online platform for the global Ismaili community. This episode was filmed in London by Ali Reza Padania and Riaz Tinwala. And here's the team at the Ismaili who helped put it together. Amira Jiwani is the series producer. Azim Lakhani is the editor, with assistance from Suraya Mirali for subtitling. Rasul Daya and Aleem Karmali have reviewed content and helped with promotion on the Ismaili website. Layla Sharif is our social media strategist, who's managing the Muslim Footprints social media accounts. And Alia Mohammed is supporting with promoting the series externally. Shahid Karim, who oversees the team at the Ismaili, is executive producer for the show, along with me. We're grateful to our external reviewers, who are all members of the board of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. These include Dr. Nadia Ibu Jamal, who lectures on the history of Muslim societies, Ali Asani, who is the Albertson Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Professor of Indo-Muslim and Islamic Religion and Cultures at Harvard University, Arif Jamal, Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore, and Dr. Farid Panjwani, who is the Dean of the Institute for Educational Development at the Aga Khan University. Additional reviews were also provided by Dr. Alnur Danani, who specializes in the history of Islamic science, philosophy, and religious thought. And thank you all for watching. Be sure to follow our social media pages where you can find additional content and keep up to date with our news. My name is Aisha Daya, and you've been watching Muslim Footprints.